We have been involved in oat test weight studies for a number of years now. From those studies, we have learned that increasing rates of nitrogen decrease oat test weights, and that a variety such as Summit can maintain high test weights compared to a variety such as CS Camden. This is important because grain millers in Yorkton will discount oats with a test weight below 245 grams per half a liter and will outright reject oats with any test weights below 230 grams per half a liter. We did a number of trials in 2020. Unfortunately, 2020 was a very dry year for Yorkton. It was pretty frustrating as we seemed to be the dry spot in a sea of adequate rainfall. The long-term rainfall average for May and June is 131 millimeters. In 2020, we only received 50 millimeters, and we did not have enough stored soil moisture to properly carry the crop through that dry period. So our oat crop was very short and yield was way below normal, averaging 66 bushels per acre. But this created an opportunity to compare CS Camden and Summit in good times and in bad. Now let's go inside and see what Mike has to say.
Thanks, Heather. In 2019 and 2020, we were involved in a study that evaluated the yield and test weight response of CS Camden and Summit to increasing rates of nitrogen. Our highest nitrogen rate tested was 178 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Now, at this point, I know you've got two questions. Why the funny number? And why so much? Well, 178 pounds of nitrogen per acre is 200 kilograms per hectare, and, well, researchers like to work in metric. But don't worry, I've converted everything to imperial for this presentation, because when I don't, the crowd says, "Can you speak in English?" The amount? Well, yeah, it is excessive, but this trial is being conducted right across Canada under a wide range of environmental conditions. But, as an aside, even at the highest rate of nitrogen, we didn't have any significant lodging for any variety in either year. We're kind of finding that old recommendation of 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre for oats is kind of outdated and really should be more like 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But you know your farm best, and I'll let you decide. Anyway, I'll digress, and now we'll get to the results of this study. I'm going to show you 4 figures that are all set up like this and use the same scales so that it's easy to make direct comparisons. Along the bottom, we have increasing rates of applied nitrogen. The blue scale on the left is bushels per acre, and the yield response of oats is represented by the blue line. The orange scale on the right is test weight in grams per half a liter, and the response is represented by the orange line. The green double arrow at the right marks 245 grams per half a liter. If the orange test weight line falls below this level, then grain millers will discount the grain. If test weights fall below the double purple arrow at 230 grams per half a liter, then the oats will be rejected. This particular figure is for Summit oats during the drought of 2020. You can see by the blue line that yield is very low, and there is only a modest response to added nitrogen up to 71 pounds of nitrogen per acre. It then plateaus and starts to drop off after 107 pounds of nitrogen per acre. If you look at the orange line, you can see test weights are way above discount levels, regardless of applied nitrogen. Here are the 4 figures together that I want you to compare. This may be hard to see if you're watching on a phone, but I mostly want you to compare the positions of the orange test weight and the blue yield response lines. Summit oats during the 2020 drought, which we just discussed, is in the top left corner. The top 2 figures show the yield and test weight response to added nitrogen for Summit and CS Camden during the drought of 2020. The bottom 2 figures show Summit and Camden during a much better growing season in 2019. During the drought, the yield response to added nitrogen was similar but poor for both Summit and Camden. The test weights for Camden are much lower than those for Summit. However, even for CS Camden, test weights are still way above the discount level, as indicated by the double green arrow and the dashed line. The yield response for Summit and Camden is much stronger in 2019 than it was during the drought in 2020. For both varieties, yield doesn't plateau until we hit 107 pounds of nitrogen per acre during the good year. You'll note the orange test weight line drops sharply between the drought in 2020 and the good year in 2019 for Summit and Camden. However, Summit is still maintaining better test weights than CS Camden during the good year. At 71 pounds of nitrogen per acre and above, test weight for Summit crosses the green discount range, but never goes below the purple rejection line. In contrast, test weight for CS Camden is on the rejection line for rates of nitrogen above 107 pounds per acre. I don't really understand how environment affects test weight. I've been told that a lack of moisture during flowering and grain fill can reduce test weight. However, test weights in our study were higher during a drought.
So it would appear that Summit can maintain better test weights than CS Camden in drought and in good conditions. Summit and CS Camden are both on grain millers' preferred variety lists for this area, but we were wondering how the other varieties would stack up against each other. So during the drought of 2020, we evaluated the yield and test weight response of CS Camden, Summit, CDC Ruffian, CDC Minstrel, and Leggett to increasing rates of N. Now let's go back inside to Mike and see how the trial turned out.
This figure shows the yield and test weight response for each variety averaged over nitrogen rate from Yorkton during the 2020 drought. The blue bars are the yield and the orange boxes show the test weight. CDC Ruffian yielded significantly more than any of the other varieties and maintained a decent test weight. Ruffian has yielded well in our past studies, but should not have yielded as well as it did based on regional trial data published in the Seed Guide. Ruffian may have received a little yield advantage in this study because its emergence was significantly lower than the other varieties. If we switch slides for a moment to look at the emergence for each variety, you'll note the plant emergence for Ruffian at 236 per meter squared was significantly lower than the emergence for the other varieties, which range from 261 to 318 plants per meter squared. It is possible the lower plant population resulted in less interplant competition for moisture during the drought and in turn higher yield. We targeted 350 live seeds per meter squared for each variety based on vigor test and 1,000 kernel weight, but we still got a little variation in emergence. Anyway, let's go back to the oat test weight and yield data. As we have observed in the past, the test weight for Summit and CS Camden are at polar extremes. This difference is definitely supported by regional test data. Low test weight often gets CS Camden into trouble as rates of N are increased, whereas Summit rarely gets into trouble. Though not as high as Summit, CDC Minstrel and Leggett also had good test weights. So test weight wise, none of the varieties are as low as CS Camden and none are higher than Summit. So if you're a producer that is struggling with low test weight, try growing Summit. If you want to try and push your nitrogen rates higher, I wouldn't try a CS Camden because it often gets into trouble based on low test weight. Well, that's about it. And I'd just like to end by thanking Adopt for supporting this particular study.